Hi, folks. Welcome back to another episode of Take Flight Podcast. This is episode number 252, and this is part of our Take Flight Takeaway episode, where one of the hosts of Take Flight Podcast walks you through a topic that they're interested in and they feel like you can gain real value from. This week's episode will be hosted by myself, OLU or Canola. In this week's episode, I want to go through a debate that's talked about a lot. Should you rent? Should you buy? Now, if you've been listening to the podcast over the last year, you would know I've just sold my apartment. And one of the decisions I've been struggling with is whether I should rent or buy my next home. But before we get started, just a quick disclaimer. This podcast is for information purposes only. Matters discussed are not intended to provide and should not be relied on as investment, accounting, legal, tax, or recommendations. The views presented are those of the host of Take Flight Podcast. We advise that you seek and obtain independent professional advice in relation to your personal circumstances. Let's get started. So, as I mentioned, I just sold my apartment a few months ago. And one of the decisions I've been struggling with is whether I should buy or rent my next home. If you're currently questioning if you should buy or rent, then this video is right for you and you should stick around to the end because I'll let you know my decision on whether I'm going to buy or rent my next home. So the first thing you should consider when deciding if you should buy or rent is your personal circumstances. We were taught from a young age that you should buy your own home. Renting is a waste of money. You're paying the landlord's mortgage. Giving them profit is a waste of money. You should never rent. Buy. That used to be the case, that it was just such a blanket statement. But I think the circumstances and economics have changed significantly, where if you live in a big city like London, New York, you really have to take more factors into consideration. So let's look at the data. Now, this is average value of homes in London from Jan 1995 to June 2024. So if you're looking at a detached home, 3-bedroom, you're looking at roughly around 260K in 1995 versus today, you're looking at 1.9 million. That's an increase of around 600%, plus 600%. If you look at semi-detached, you're looking at 135K versus roughly around 970K. Again, another 600% increase. If you're looking at a terrace property, you're looking at 112K versus 940K today, north of 700% increase. So you can see the dynamic when it comes to the value of a home has increased significantly, especially in big cities such as London. If we compare that to salary, so if we look at roughly the average salary in 1995, I had that data, which was £7.92 per hour versus end of 2023, which was £17.48 per hour. Now, even if we were to increase it slightly, you're seeing that salary is probably gone up by 200% versus value of the home, which has gone up by 600, 700%. So you can see the affordability of homes are starting to get to a place where it just doesn't make sense. It's not affordable. Your value of your home versus your salary has gone to such a multiple that it's starting to become ridiculous and not make sense to buy homes. It's not the same as when our parents were in the early 2000s, they purchased a home and it's gone up over the period of time. Now you've actually got to really sit down and question, does it make sense purchasing a house? In most people's lives, that's going to be their biggest purchase. So the real question you need to ask yourself is, does it make sense to purchase a home? Also, if we look at interest rates are roughly around 5% today. Let's take another example. You look at a property for 500K. You put a 10% deposit down. That means you're borrowing around 450K. If we look at 5% interest rates, now I know it fluctuates up and down, but let's say flat 5% over 30 years, you will have to pay back 1,027,000. That means the interest that you're paying back, right? The cost of borrowing is around 577K. So a lot of people say, oh, you're just throwing away money when you rent. But you can argue the exact same thing with purchasing when you're taking out a mortgage. You're throwing away money for the cost of borrowing, the interest that you're paying. Forget even just your principal 450K that you're borrowing. So that made me just sit down and think, okay, I need to look deeper into my circumstances. And if my circumstances make sense, personal circumstances make sense for buying or renting. Now, I'm single. I don't have any kids. I enjoy living in inner London. I'm a high investor. I like to travel a lot. Sorry, this is starting to sound like a dating profile, but let me be serious. Like all those factors that I just mentioned to you scream renting, right? Now, this would be completely different if I was married, right? I had kids and I was living in a good school district where I wanted the kids to be settled. I had maybe a family member that was going to live with me, one of my mom or my mother-in-law living with us, right? Then it might make sense to purchase a home. But what you'll see is those reasons I mentioned for renting had nothing to do with investment. It had nothing to do with it growing in terms of a home is a great investment. It had to do with stability. So again, it might be the right decision for you to purchase versus rent. But the first thing you should really consider is your personal circumstances and ask yourself, does those circumstances make sense when buying or renting? So the next thing I did was I sat down and I asked myself a few questions on should I buy or should I rent? First one is, am I ready to commit to buying a place and staying there for the next 10 years? I said, no, I'm single, right? If you know anyone that's married, right, they'll tell you when they got married, their partner either didn't like the location, the house that they lived in, right? So they had to uplift and move. So why make a decision on where you're going to stay for the next 10 years whilst you're single? Doesn't make sense for me. Next question I asked myself is, can I afford to rent? So I looked at the market, looked at what the rental price was going to be, and I said, how much of my gross salary is that rent? It came up to 17%. Now, that is really low. They say on average you should spend around, they'll say 30% of your gross income on accommodation, rent, or mortgage, whatever. I'm within 17%. That means that gap I can invest. So I can rent comfortably and then use the incremental amount to continue to invest, grow, and compound. After that, I sat down and ran the numbers. I went through two scenarios. One, if I was renting a property, another scenario, if I was purchasing a property, and look to see what does the numbers say. A lot of people don't run the numbers. Now, I was listening to a really good podcast where the guy said something that was perfect for this. He said, rent is the maximum you'll pay, but a mortgage is the minimum you'll pay. Because with your mortgage, right, you still got to think about your deposit, your property insurance, your maintenance in case the roof or something goes wrong and you have to fix it. If I'm renting and I'm a tenant, all I've got to consider is my rent. I pay that every single month. If something goes wrong, there's a boiler stops working, I just call the landlord and it gets fixed. In my apartment, there was a time where the boiler stopped working. I had to replace and buy a new boiler. That cost me 3K, I think, 4K to replace the boiler. Now, that responsibility fell on me because it was my home. I was a homeowner, right? I was the big dog. I was responsible for replacing it. Completely different story if I'm renting. So let me go through an example of the numbers I ran. And I'm just going to use my screen. So if I'm looking at my screen for the folks on YouTube, it's because I'm running the numbers or running you through the numbers. I looked at how much it would cost to rent. In the example that I had, it was around 1,800 to rent. I also looked online to say for the same location, a one bedroom apartment, if I wanted to purchase, how much would that cost me? And that came up to 700K. So 700K. That's the value to purchase within the area that I was looking to rent. Deposit. right? 10%. So 70K deposit. Another fee that I need to take into consideration, stamp duty. So stamp duty for the property, around 22,500. Then I've got all like the fees. So solicitor fee, broker fee, moving costs, etc. I put just roughly around 10K. With that property, if I'm borrowing, right, the mortgage payment would be roughly around 3,800, right? Next thing you need to calculate is maintenance, right? I took roughly around 10% of my mortgage payment, so £370 a month just to be stored in terms of maintenance. You can argue that that might be slightly high, whatever, but that's towards if you have a leak in your property, you might need to change a boiler, any maintenance that you might have within the property. Next thing I took into consideration was service charge. I put roughly around £2,000 a year towards service charge, which you have to pay. I looked at 25 years out. If I look at all the costs I've mentioned, so the deposit, the stamp duty, the fees, the mortgage, maintenance, service charge over 25 years. So if you take all those factors into consideration, the amount that I'll be paying over 25 years would be 1.4 million. Now, if I was to divide that over 25 years and get the monthly rate, that's roughly around 4,800 per month. That's versus the 1.8 that I'm paying for rent, right? That's an incremental 3K more that I would pay to own versus rent. Now, I understand the rent will go up. I'm just going to assume it'll go up with inflation over the period of time. If I was to, and this is where opportunity cost comes into play. So if I had to take all the initial money that I had to put down, so that's the deposit, the stamp duty, the fee, you're looking at roughly around 102K. If I was to put that into the market, and then also that 3K difference between how much it costs to own versus the cost to rent into the stock market over 25 years, assuming a conservative sort of 7% growth, that would get me to 4.3 million. Yes, you heard that right. 4.3 million versus, and let's assume this property has doubled over that 20-25 years, right? I would have paid it off, but I would only have a property that's worth 1.4 million, right? Now, what I can do, and most people might be considering, is okay, so what happens if you rent for the next 25 years and you retire? What are you going to do? With that opportunity cost, so what I said is the money that I would have used as a initial payment, so the down payment, the stamp duty, etc., and then the incremental difference between renting and owning, the amount that I'm saving from renting, if I was to invest, key thing, invest that money, right, over the 25 years, so that will give you up to 4.3 million that you would have after 25 years. And I can decide if I want to purchase a home outright with cash, right? I'll have no interest payments in the future to pay because I'll be paying with cash. And I wouldn't have had all the fees and additional costs associated to owning a home. So when I started to run those numbers, I started to say, wait, for me in my personal circumstances, especially because I'm disciplined enough to invest and I've been already investing for the last 10 years, it doesn't make sense for me to purchase a home at these economics, right? Where interest rates are quite high, the value are quite high, especially in London. It just doesn't make sense. So now, where it might potentially make sense was if I was potentially looking to leave London, right? And say, hey, I would go to a location where the value of homes are not as high, right? And when I run that calculation and those numbers, it might make more sense. And if rent was a lot higher and a lot higher, where that gap or that savings that I would make versus buying or renting would be significantly lower. So if you've stuck around to this part of the episode, I'll let you know what my decision is. So based on my personal circumstances, as I mentioned before, single, don't have any kids, don't really want to commit to a particular area. And after running the numbers and finding out that it's actually cheaper for me to rent than to purchase in the area that I want to live in, I'm deciding to rent. I'm going to rent for the foreseeable future until my personal circumstances change, right? until maybe I'm married, have kids, I want more stability, I want to stay in a particular location. But when I make that decision, it won't be a financial decision because in most cases, especially when you're in big cities or near a big city, it's actually currently cheaper to rent versus to buy when you take into consideration all the costs associated to owning a home. But the key thing to take into consideration and the key thing that I'm doing, even though I'm renting, is I'm investing heavily. And I think that's the caveat to this whole episode and this whole debate about buying versus renting. Renting makes sense if you're paying a low percentage of your gross income. So as I mentioned before, I'm currently doing 17%. If you're able to save and invest a large portion of the rest of your gross income, key thing invest, then that's able to compound and grow so that when you do reach retirement age, you can decide when you've got a million plus in your pension or investment fund, stocks and shares ISA, to decide to purchase cash right versus quote unquote wasting money, like people say, with renting with interest rates. Now, if I was to buy, there would probably be certain rules that I would take into consideration. I personally won't purchase a high value home unless I was putting 20+% deposit. I think the problem that we find is when it comes to purchasing homes, we all purchase too much of a home. And what I mean about that is we feel like the maximum I can afford is 1 million. So I'm going to purchase a home that's worth 1 million versus understanding that if you do purchase a home for 1 million plus or 500K or whatever your ceiling is or a large amount based on your income, you are a slave to that home. You have to work constantly to meet that high mortgage payment. And you're then sacrificing from investing. And that's what you find. And if you look at a lot of people, the average people's net worth calculation, you find that a lot of their net worth is in their home and is not in any liquid assets such as stocks because of the fact that they've only been able to prioritize paying back their mortgage versus investing because their mortgage payment has been so high when you look at it as a percentage of their gross income. I hope this episode has been really useful. I know there's been a lot of numbers thrown out, a lot of information thrown out, but me personally, but I hope this is giving you the right questions and tools when navigating your decision on if you should buy or rent. So, firstly, understand your personal circumstances. Understand what is motivating you to buy versus rent. And again, that is not a financial decision, but it's okay. Secondly, run the numbers. Understand, is it cheaper for you to buy or rent? Like I said in the episode, rent is the maximum you'll pay, but your mortgage is the minimum you'll pay. Take into consideration other costs such as maintenance, stamp duty, property insurance, other costs that you have to take into consideration when owning versus when renting. Thirdly, make sure it's affordable, right? A lot of people put themselves into a lot of stress, especially debt stress, by borrowing too much and buying too much of a home. Make sure when you're calculating that your mortgage, rent, whatever your living expenses doesn't exceed 30% of your gross income. So I hope you found this episode really helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on Take Flight Podcast, or you can reach out to me directly, OLU_Okanola on YouTube, Instagram. Take care and God bless.